Welcome to the Two Disabled Dudes podcast. We believe life is about how we react. Hey, welcome back. Thanks for joining us today. This is episode 146, our fourth in the drug development series. And we found a lot of meat in this conversation because for Kyle and I as patients, this is where we get involved. So we believe that you as our listeners are really going to take a lot from this. So we're going to jump right in because it's a long one. Enjoy the conversation with Jen Farmer. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the show.
Kyle and Sean, thank you for inviting me. I'm so excited to participate today. I'm a big fan of the podcast. I've listened to all 5 seasons, and so I feel really privileged to be on as a guest.
This is great. I also want to point out to our listeners that you might have a different experience in this one, or you might notice Kyle is more politically correct and in line because Jen is his boss. So I just want to make sure our listeners understand the chain of command here.
I'll be watching myself for this episode.
I don't know. I feel like you guys are the boss today, not me. I am not driving this.
All right, Jen, you know that this season we've been doing the top 5 segment. So we want you to give us the top 5. What are you going to share with us today?
Well, Kyle, I love to cook, as you know. And so I thought I would share my top 5 home-cooked meals. Cooking for me is a way to, relieve some stress, have a little bit of a creative outlet. It's also, it's an important time of day for our family that we're all together. So I thought it'd be fun to share my top 5 home cooked meals. And maybe since, with the pandemic, more people cooking, they'd appreciate some new ideas. So my first one is Kung Pao chicken. Alan's my husband. He and I first tried this recipe when we were dating. And it was the first time early on that I can remember, that we shared this joy of cooking together and trying new recipes and challenging ourselves to do more complicated recipes. And it's turned into a staple. 25 years and we're still making Kung Pao chicken.
Wow. So is it hard to do?
It seemed really hard early on, but we figured it out where it's now a weeknight meal. So One of my other favorite meals to prepare is grilled salmon with saffron rice and a nice salad. And it's one of my go-to recipes when I have friends over. It's just a staple. And I have lots of great memories of serving this with friends around the table. Another one is a gnocchi recipe that has Italian sausage and spinach in it. It's my son Garrett's favorite meal that I make. And it's super easy to prepare. It's easy weeknight. I don't think it takes me more than about half an hour to put together. Wow. And it's always yummy and it makes him happy.
Gnocchi is a stuffed noodle, right?
No, it's like a potato noodle.
A potato, that's right. Okay. Do you make those? The noodle itself? Or okay, so that's where you go. You play with the sauce and the...
Yeah, it's all about the
it's like 30 minutes to stuff a potato in a noodle? That's amazing.
Not that good.
Okay.
Not that good.
Okay.
But I do buy fresh gnocchi. And
nice.
Fresh gnocchi only takes about 2 to 3 minutes to cook. Another one of my favorite meals to cook is breaded fried chicken cutlet over arugula with lemon. That's Luke's favorite meal that I make. And that's what we're having tonight.
All right.
And then finally, my fifth and my most favorite meal of the year is Thanksgiving dinner. I love to host Thanksgiving. I love to cook it. A lot of people complain because there's like so many side dishes and turkey and And I love it all. And I love to plan it out. And I love to make the whole meal and have lots of people around the table.
How big is that group normally? Like outside of COVID, what would the average be?
Somewhere between 12 and 16.
It's a good sized group.
I've never been in charge of the Thanksgiving meal, but when you mention all the sides and the different pieces that go into a big meal, how do you keep everything warm?
I have 2 ovens. That's critical. Got to have 2 ovens if you're going to do Thanksgiving dinner. I've been cooking Thanksgiving dinner now, for a long time, and have figured out lots of tricks along the way. Warming dishes ahead of time so that the dishes themselves stay warm, so that when you put the mashed potatoes in them, they stay warm longer, things like that.
Yeah, I bet it's a trick of like knowing exactly how long things are going to take too, so they can be all ready at a similar time.
Yeah, that is the trick to Thanksgiving, is having everything ready at the same time. But when I cook Thanksgiving dinner, I have like 4 or 5 things that are my standard go-tos. I make them every single year. Like I have the exact same cranberry sauce and I have the exact same stuffing recipe. But then I'll try something different each year too, and do some different stuff.
That's cool.
So, Jen, as you know, this is not a cooking show. And we have asked you here today to talk about the drug development process and specifically the clinical stage. And first of all, for our listeners, can you just give a little overview of kind of your career journey to get us into that frame of mind?
Sure. So I had my training as a genetic counselor. And shortly after starting my first job at the University of Pennsylvania in adult medical genetics, I had the opportunity to start working with physicians and researchers who wanted to do what we call clinical research, so research in people. And sometimes clinical research involves testing a new medicine, but sometimes it's also just studying people to understand a condition better. And so early on in my career, I also went through training to be a clinical research coordinator and had the ability to work on a number of different research studies related to understanding the genetics of specific diseases, including FA, and pretty quickly focused my time and attention into Friedreich's ataxia and another neurodegenerative disease called frontotemporal dementia, and continued to grow my clinical research experience at Penn and then eventually Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and worked with Dr. David Lynch, Rob Wilson, Kurt Fishback, and they really helped me learn a lot about clinical research and Friedreich's ataxia. And that was kind of how I got to know the FA community, obviously, and transitioned to FARA back in 2005.
So how did you go from working in the medical world to doing nonprofit?
That's a great question. At the time, early in my career as a genetic counselor and clinical research coordinator, I was really active in several other nonprofit groups, both patient advocacy groups for the rare diseases that I was working in at the time. And so I was having the ability to kind of see what these organizations were doing. And I found that really interesting and empowering. And then I was also part of a professional organization for genetic counselors. And that was also a nonprofit organization. And I was involved on the board of directors. I served as treasurer, I served as finance chair, and worked closely with the executive director of that nonprofit, and really learned a lot about nonprofit management through that volunteer experience. And so I think all these things kind of came together at once, like seeing the opportunity of patient advocacy groups and research groups, and understanding nonprofit from my volunteer experiences, and seeing the opportunity to, focus on Friedreich's ataxia, where I thought I had the opportunity to try and make a difference. And these things kind of all came together for me at once.
Last episode, we were talking about the preclinical stage. And how does it kind of pass off from there to clinical?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kyle, and it's complicated. That phase before clinical that we call preclinical or IND enabling involves a number of really important key aspects, and working through those are really what allow you to move from that preclinical to clinical. So, for example, I'm sure you've talked about in some of your earlier episodes, right, the concept of proof of concept, like showing how this treatment or this intervention works in cell and animal models. There's manufacturing of whatever the drug is itself, right? Figuring out that whole manufacturing process and making sure that every time you make this drug, you make the same drug over and over again. And then testing that drug for safety, for biodistribution, for toxicity. And, there are a lot of regulatory requirements around manufacturing and around preclinical testing that you have to go through and demonstrate proficiency and understanding in before you can move to clinical. But, once you kind of have done all of those things, checked all those boxes, the next step to really knowing whether or not a drug or an intervention is going to work is testing in people. Testing in people is what we call clinical development.
So in the clinical stage, there are a lot of parties involved, right? Not only are you looking for patient volunteers, but at that point, you've got the sponsor, right? The folks that have the idea of the drug. And then you've got all these different sites and the different coordinators in the mix, different doctors in the mix. You're in the mix depending on the disease state. So the advocacy groups. How do you keep that entire group on the same page?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an orchestra, right? Like if you think of an orchestra, you've got all different members of the orchestra, each, playing their own instrument, contributing their own area of expertise. And you need them all, and you need them all to be on the same page, playing the same song at the same time with the same rhythm. And it can be a real challenge. But ultimately, in most cases, where there's a drug company involved, the sponsor, they're the ones who are responsible for conducting that orchestra and making sure that they bring all the right musicians, all the right people with all the right areas of expertise and knowledge together to conduct these clinical trials. And I like this analogy because I've had the opportunity to see sponsors work through this process, and they'll go out and talk to lots of different vendors, right? People who could package the drug for them. They're going to interview tons of those different vendors to see which one's going to do it right. They're going to look at different manufacturing organizations and pick the right one to do it right. They're going to look at the different sites that are going to potentially be able to participate, and they're going to interview them and review their capabilities and understand and make sure that they really do have all the expertise, the equipment, the capability to do the study that they want them to do. And so they're going to go out and conduct tryouts and, do their diligence to make sure that everybody that they bring to the clinical study has the capabilities and that they're going to be able to work with them.
So there's this role called the principal investigator of a trial, and how does that play in? If if the company is the conductor, then what kind of role does the principal investigator play?
That's a great question. So, if you think about the company and the sponsor, they have an interest in this drug, right? Or this intervention. They've invested a lot of resources, time, money, people. They believe that this has value if they're going to do the study. And so it's important that they seek out a partner, in this case, a principal investigator, somebody to conduct the study so that the study itself can be conducted in a way where there's a word that we call equipoise. And it's really important in clinical research and specifically clinical trials for the clinical research to be conducted with equipoise. And what it means is that there's a balance of forces or balance of interests. And so you need that principal investigator to be somebody who does not have an interest really in the outcome of this or hasn't already decided drug A is better than drug B going into the trial. You need somebody and you need groups of people and the medical community to really be at a place where no, they don't know whether A or B is better. And so, conducting randomized controlled trial really allows you to test which is better, A or B. And so that principal investigator is someone who certainly has equipoise, but is also responsible for the actual conduct of the trial. And what I mean by that is they're responsible for making sure that, if you think of them as a section leader in the band, in the orchestra, they're leading their section, making sure that all the folks in their section are trained, they're equipped, they know what they're supposed to do. The principal investigator is responsible for the safety of the subjects and making sure that the rights of the subjects are maintained, making sure that subjects are given the opportunity to provide informed consent. And the investigator also has responsibilities around the scientific integrity of the study. And so they are working closely with the sponsor. The sponsor ultimately gives them the protocol that has to be done, but the principal investigator has had an opportunity to weigh into, how that study is designed, how it's going to be conducted, what their roles and responsibilities are going to be, and making sure that this is a study that they can conduct.
So when you talk about study design, let's hang out there for a minute in terms of how it's designed, specifically when you're talking about eligibility criteria or inclusion exclusion criteria. I know that's going to be important for a lot of patients. Some folks love to be a part of the trial, some don't. But for those that want to be a part of the trials and there's some random exclusion criteria, how do you balance trying to, in your case, as the advocate, you want a clean, quote unquote, trial, but you also want to help as many patients as you can. How does that play into the design of a study?
Designing a study is really hard. And this is something that I have really grown to appreciate over the last 15 years as I've had the opportunity to work closely with our industry partners and our site investigators and biostatisticians in the regulatory agencies as those groups come together and think about how to design a trial. There's so much that goes into it, and it depends on a lot of different things. So, it depends on the type of trial. Is this a small drug where, you take the pills, but 24, 48 hours later, those drugs are gone, they're out of your system? Or is this a gene therapy where we could potentially be making a permanent change that's irreversible? Or is this a surgical intervention? Depending on the type of intervention will absolutely impact the design of the trial. Where you're trying to target your therapy is going to impact the design of your trial. Are you trying to, is your drug designed to treat the cardiac disease of FA? Is it trying to treat the balance and coordination aspects where it needs to get to the brain? Is it an intervention where you're trying to do both? Because depending on, what target systems you're trying to treat, you might have to select your population where you think that intervention is going to show the most effect. And so, for example, if we stick with like the cardiac aspect of FA, which is really important to our community, it gets very tricky very quickly. Like you want people who obviously have some evidence of the cardiac disease, but not everybody with FA gets cardiac disease. And so how much evidence of cardiac disease do you need to see? At what point in time is the intervention going to be given? And then, how are you going to know whether or not it's working? And so your inclusion exclusion criteria for a cardiac study is going to look very different than the inclusion exclusion criteria potentially for a study where we're looking at balance and coordination. As you think about all these different aspects related to what you're trying to test and what you're trying to study, you then have to design this inclusion exclusion criteria. And as a reminder, right, clinical trials are experiments. Sometimes we get very hopeful, very excited, and think of clinical trials as clinical interventions. We like to think of them as treatments before they're tested. And they're not. They're experiments. And so when you do an experiment, you want to have a very controlled setting. And in the context of humans, that's really hard. People are not easy to control.
Tell me about it. Kyle's my co-host.
So we try and control the things we can. And so those might be like the traits that we pick up for our inclusion-exclusion criteria. We've ruled out things that can create noise in conducting our experiment. And that can be really hard because, Sean, as an advocate, I want everyone to be a part of clinical trials. I want the clinical trials to test all aspects of FA. And I want to think about treatments that are going to treat all stages of the disease. And so it can be really hard when you have to start in a very narrow place and slowly work your way out.
Jen, I know that is hard, especially specifically with the age group thing, because a lot of times there's an age limit of 16 or 18 on a clinical trial. And what are the factors? I mean, I'm sure safety is probably the highest factor, right? But what are some of the factors that go into specifically the age group?
Kyle, you're absolutely right. Safety is number one. And again, remember, these are experiments. These are drugs that are not approved most of the time for other indications. So these might be drugs that are for the first time going to be tested in people. And so typically when a drug is first tested in people, you start in adults because you don't fully know the safety. The other big piece is informed consent. Being able to say for yourself, I understand the potential risks involved in this, and I can, I'm choosing myself to sign up for this study and participate in this study once I understand all the risks and benefits. There's no magic to 18 being, it's not like on your 18th birthday, all of a sudden you're have all this wisdom, right? Where you can do that. Whereas when you were 17, you couldn't. But 18 is the age legally where individuals are able to sign their own informed consent forms and make their own decisions without their parents. And somebody under the age of 18 is providing what's called assent. And ideally, you want the child and the parent to both agree to participate in the study. But obviously, very young children, certainly infants and young children, even, middle childhood, 10, 11, 12 years of age, probably not able to really provide true informed consent. And so better to start trials in adults, understand what the potential benefit is. And then once we, understand better what the safety is in people, we can then transition. You also have to have certain testing done on the drug preclinically in animals. You have to do juvenile toxicology studies to be able to test drugs in children. And so sometimes companies won't start there, right? They'll start with the adult animal studies because those are also easier to conduct prior to doing the juvenile studies. So there's regulatory considerations, there's safety considerations, and then importantly, informed consent.
You mentioned at some point in there regulatory agencies, and what that brings to mind for me is thinking about doing studies in multiple areas, right? Whether it's different hospitals, different regions, or even different countries. We know FA specifically, we've got a lot going on here in the US, a little bit in Brazil, a little bit in Australia, a little bit in Canada. All of these different countries have different rules, different expectations, different standards. How are those differences managed?
Yeah, there are different regulatory considerations across all different regulatory agencies as you go across the globe. What we were just talking about, age of informed consent, is also not the same around the world. So there are many countries where the age of 16, one is considered an adult and able to make their own decisions and, provide informed consent. So there are lots of differences. Fortunately, as advocates involved in diseases and working in the rare disease community, where often it is important to conduct clinical trials at the international level, because in order to get enough individuals with that rare disease studied, you often have to, include multiple countries. And so there have been good efforts to have some harmonization of requirements across government agencies. And so the FDA and the EMA, which is the European Medical Association, and regulatory agencies in Japan and Australia and Brazil, they talk to each other. And there are meetings and, opportunities to kind of facilitate this harmonization. It's not perfect harmonization. There are clearly differences. We can all point to examples of where, it's easier to start a trial in country X versus country Y, or the drug got approved in this country before it got approved here. There are differences, and the sponsors have whole teams of regulatory staff with expertise in different countries' regulatory guidance to kind of help the company, again, based on the drug, the type of intervention, what they know about the risk-benefit profile, what you know about the patient population, trying to figure out which countries are going to be the best to conduct the trial in.
Jen, our last episode, we talked about the topic of risk tolerance and adverse events and how you define adverse. And I'm wondering, an adverse event could potentially stop a clinical trial. You've got to stop giving this drug because somebody had a bad reaction to it. And have you had experience with clinical trials or a trial that had to stop because of an adverse event?
Yeah, great question. And we have had an experience in the FA community where a trial has had to stop because of adverse events. First, this Data Safety Monitoring Board, or DSMB, is a group that is assembled that is responsible throughout the trial to be looking at the adverse events over time as they're occurring and just, monitoring what's happening, so that, you want to keep your individual site investigators, right, somewhat blinded to what's going on. You want them to maintain equipoise. You don't want them to, be trying to figure out who's on drug and who's not on drug. You need to maintain a blind in a clinical trial. And so this DSMB is a group that has the ability to see these adverse events and even be unblinded to understand if a drug is causing an adverse event. And the DSMB can then advise the investigators and the drug company if the study should be stopped because there are adverse events that appear to be related to the drug. One example was we were doing a clinical trial of a drug called deferaprone, which is a drug that chelates or takes iron out of the cell, and specifically allows for iron to be removed from the mitochondria. And the study was ongoing at multiple sites, and it was a dose escalation study. And so there were 3 doses that were being tested. They started at the lowest dose. It looked safe. They had no concerns at the low dose. Then they moved to the next cohort with the next higher dose. Well, when they got to the 3rd cohort, the highest dose, they noticed that the DSMB was able to see that there were more reports of worsening of neurologic function. And they could actually see that there was enough of this reported worsening of neurologic function, and seeing the neurologic exam scores reflect that. And then, ask the statisticians to remove the blind so that they could see, are these changes in both the placebo group and the treatment group, or in only the treatment group. And they only saw the worsening of neurologic function in the treatment group. And so they actually stopped the study early due to adverse events. But, there are also adverse events that occur that have nothing to do with the drug. And it's really important when you're in a clinical trial and something else is happening to you, to really be honest about what's happening and give the investigators and the site coordinators, the nurses, all the information that you have about what's happening. Because, sometimes the events are not related to the drug, and the study investigator needs to have all that information to try and determine, okay, is this happening because of the drug, or is this happening for some other reason?
When it comes to clinical trial and needing to stop because of some adverse events, is that considered the end for that drug, or is there an opportunity to revamp a little bit and kind of go back a couple steps for the sponsor and, with regulatory agencies in mind? What does that mean for that drug?
That's a great question. And again, there's a lot of different factors that are going to play into that, but it doesn't necessarily mean the end. I told you that the first dose and the second dose of that deferiprone trial did not have adverse events. So it may have just been that top dose was too much, and that going back to the middle dose would be sufficient. And so you also look at the data that you then have to say, okay, that middle dose, do we have any clues in looking at the clinical data that middle dose could be beneficial? And so if they had seen data in the middle dose that said, oh, it looks like this is working and this dose is sufficient and we don't have to go to the high dose, that they could have run another study at just the middle dose. They might also understand something about, let's say, how the drug's being metabolized that makes it produce that side effect. And maybe they can go back to the lab and get rid of that, do medicinal chemistry and change the drug a little bit to reduce that side effect and come back and try again. So just because a trial is stopped because of an adverse event doesn't necessarily mean that that's the end of the road. Interestingly, I don't know if people realize this, but let's say you're in a clinical trial and you have a car accident. You go back for your next trial visit and you're in a cast. That's an adverse event.
Yeah.
Had nothing to do with the drug, right? Especially, let's say, if you weren't even driving, right? You're in an Uber and in an accident. But that is still an adverse event. Anything that happens to you during the time that you're in a trial gets captured. And so that's when I was saying before, it's really important to provide the study team with all the information around what's going on with you. It can be, that information gets captured, but it gets recorded as non-drug related adverse event.
That creates a question for me because, and I don't know if it's my personality type or age or whatever it is, but I've realized in my years of participating in trials here and there are some things that I don't think are related, so I don't talk about them. And, I've learned over the years, okay, it's better to overshare and let the professionals decide what's relevant and what's not. How do you take into consideration the types of people that tend to share too much or not share enough at all?
Well, and that's where it's really important to have highly trained and skilled clinical trial teams, right? Investigators who both understand the underlying disease, but also understand clinical trials and how to conduct them, having clinical coordinators and nurses trained in trials. And it's important to check in with people on a regular basis, right? If it's 6 months between your trial visits, stuff's going to happen. You're not going to remember in between visits, or you're going to have things happen and you're going to forget, or you're not going to know whether or not it's important. And so, designing the study in a way where you're checking in with people regularly is one way to try and deal with that. Even if it's a phone call or a text message, using ways to allow people to, digitally record what's happening to them at home in between visits is much easier now. But it's important that the trial's designed in a way and the team is trained to give time and attention to asking and prompting, and, because we are all different, and it's important that we give people that opportunity to think about, oh, wait, that happened, or I did notice this. Maybe it's something I should share. So there are different ways you can try and deal with that, but it is part of what we think about when we design the trial. And there's 6 months between visits. Hey, should we have 2 phone calls? And that's part of why you put the phone calls in there.
This might be TMI, but I caught myself doing this recently. I had a trial visit, and a routine question is, have you fallen in the last 6 months or 12 or whatever it is? And I just say no, because sure, every now and then I might stumble, but I don't actually fall to the ground. So to me, that's just being clumsy or a little bit of FA. It's not drug related. But so not so long ago, the nurse asked, have you fallen in the last year? And I said no. And then like 30 seconds later, I'm like, wait a minute. Yeah, I fractured a couple of bones, so I should probably talk about that.
I would hope that not only would they ask, have you fallen, but might also say, hey, have you had any fractures? Have you had to go to the hospital?
That's
have you had,
Yeah.
Because
Right.
It is. Like, I go to the doctor, it's the same thing. How are you doing? Fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Any questions? No, none.
Not really.
And then, I have to pause and say, well, why the hell am I here?
Yeah, true.
It's a responsibility on both parts, on the study team, to try and help you think about things that should be discussed. But it's also, I think a part of being a good clinical trial subject and a good volunteer to be mindful that you are in an experiment. You are contributing to research, and we shouldn't be the ones deciding whether or not something is drug related. We should just be reporting what's happening and let somebody else make those determinations.
With that in mind, are there other really important responsibilities that a participant or a patient has in a clinical trial?
At our FA symposiums, when I talk about clinical trials, I always include what it really means to be in a trial and to be a study participant. And while the principal investigator has responsibilities, the sponsor has responsibilities, so does the volunteer. And, I think first and foremost, I think it's important to be informed and to be knowledgeable. Do your homework ahead of time. Like, well, why are they doing this trial? Why are they testing this drug? Why do they think this could have benefit in FA or whatever my condition is? And then what's going to be required of me? Like, is this a pill? Is it injectable? I remember there was one trial that when you took the medicine, you had to take it with milk. I know for some people, that was a big deal, right? You're lactose intolerant, or you just don't like milk, and milk 3 times a day is kind of a pain, especially adults, right? It's not like it's in kids where your parents are giving you milk all the time. As an adult, I only have milk in my coffee. That's it. Yeah. If somebody told me I had to have milk 3 times a day, I'd be like, what? So you've got to think about all of those things and say, do I want to do this? And can I do this? If you're somebody who knows you can't drink 3 glasses of milk a day for whatever reason, it's probably not the trial for you. And you know what? That's okay. I think sometimes we put so much emphasis and we all have so much pride on being in trials and participating and contributing to research that we don't allow people the space to say no. Realize that saying no is just as important sometimes as saying yes to a clinical trial. If you don't think you can do this, you don't have to. And it's better to say no than to say, oh, I'll figure it out. I'll do it. Or it doesn't really matter. I can still do the trial, but I don't have to drink the milk. It does matter. They want you to drink the milk because the drug is absorbed differently with milk than without milk. And if you don't do that, you're jeopardizing the results.
Or you get 6 weeks down the road and realize it's not for you. And then all of a sudden somebody has dropped the clinical trial, and that does not look good on paper, right?
Certainly having people withdraw is challenging for clinical trials, because when you design the study, you design it based on having a certain number of people in the study and in the study to completion. And we always, go a little bit above what we need, knowing that there are going to be reasons why people have to withdraw. Life situations, things that happen that you can't predict that might make it so that it's for your safety better for you to withdraw from a trial than keep going. And so you have to allow for that. And we do. And so we anticipate, 10% withdrawal or 20% withdrawal in a trial. But if we had 50% withdrawal or 70% withdrawal, the trial would be for nothing. We wouldn't have enough data to conclude anything. So it is important for folks to be really knowledgeable about what's being tested, what's being asked of them, and to take that informed consent process seriously. Read that consent form. Spend time with the study coordinator and the clinician going over what's involved in the study so that you are making the best decision for you about whether or not to participate. And I know there are lots of times people just want to get to the end of that form and just sign it and move on.
Amen, sister.
Yeah, but it's an important process. And if you don't want to read the form, you know what? Somebody should sit down and tell you what's in it and explain it to you and give you the time to ask questions. The second thing that I think is really important for people participating in trial, we touched on a little bit, but follow the rules. The rules are put in place for your safety. I'll say it again. The rules are put in place for your safety.
Yeah, Sean.
Not to be difficult. There's a reason and a rationale for the rules in the trial, whether the rule is to take the drug at a certain time of day or with a meal, or whether it's, if it's an injectable, to inject in your arm and then your leg. And, there are all different kinds of variations of these rules that sometimes we wonder, well, that seems dumb. It can't make a difference. Before you make that decision, ask. Mm-hmm. It can be really easy to, forget to keep the diary or keep track of the pills. Those are all really important things. And so, there is a responsibility for you in following all these rules, communicating with the investigators, like we talked about, not determining if it's a side effect, letting the study team do that. Refrain from conducting your own experiment. Right?
That's huge. Yeah.
The other thing, though, that I think is one other important piece to being a clinical trial participant is around confidentiality, right? And what we talk about. And as a participant in a trial or a group of participants, we want everyone to remain blinded as much as possible. And that becomes really important and is integral to the conduct of the trial and making sure that we get an accurate result. Biasing by unblinding can lead to very different results than if a study had remained blinded. And so sharing your experiences with others, especially others who are in the trial, is something I think is, important that folks try not to do that. It's okay to talk about what hotel you stay at, what airline you're using to get there, what food cart you go visit when you're at the hospital, things that are not related to the drug. Absolutely talk about those. Share your tips, share your experiences. But to say something that would reveal that, you're noticing something biologically different. Your urine changes a funny color, or all of a sudden, like you've noticed that you're walking better, or that this other symptom is better or worse. The other person won't be able to help but compare their experience to yours, and will automatically, right? We're humans. You're going to draw conclusions based on that. Oh, well, he's observed that and I haven't, so I'm on placebo and he's on drug. Could be completely false. You're biasing that other person by sharing what your observations related to your health or, your experience with the drug. And I encourage people to, during the blinded phase of a trial, to refrain from doing that, refrain from sharing those things on social media. When the trial's over, absolutely talk about it.
When a sponsor is, ready to move to trial or clinical trial, how do they decide where to go? And how do they take into consideration the patient's or the family's ability to show up in clinic once a month, once every 6 months, whatever the trial might call for? How are those things considered?
Sean, thanks for asking that. You're actually, I think you brought up two important points that I want to talk about. The direct question about how do you choose sites, I think is fairly straightforward. It's, you want sites where the staff is available, where they have the experience with the condition that you're studying, and that they have experience in conducting clinical trials. In common diseases, that might not be hard because, if you're doing a diabetes trial, you could have that trial conducted even at very rural centers because clinicians have to be on staff at those places who can treat diabetes and understand diabetes. But when we're dealing in rare disease, it's important that you have clinicians conducting the trial that really understand the condition and have that clinical trial experience. And so that automatically, right, narrows the number of potential sites we can have. And it does place a lot more burden on the volunteer, the individual with the disease, to get to those centers. Selecting sites is really about expertise and clinical trial experience. And I can tell you, every sponsor I've worked with has said, don't you have more experts? They would like us to have more sites available. They would like to have more diversity in clinical trial sites and make it easier for people to participate. So that is something that we've tried to do over the years, is grow our network of clinical research centers so that we are making trials more accessible and expanding our bandwidth to do clinical trials. But the other important part of your question that we haven't talked about at all is how is the patient experience and, captured in the design of a clinical trial? And this has changed. This is something I've seen huge change in over the last 15 to 20 years since I've been in the field. I would say, 15 to 20 years ago, the sponsor and the clinicians designed the trial, and they were really focused on the science and not the volunteer patient experience. And there's been a whole movement over the last 10 years because they realize without thinking about that, you get people drop out. You don't enroll the trial. One of the number one reasons why trials fail are people don't enroll. And the field learned that by talking to the patient community when you're designing your trial and sharing with them concepts of trial design or seeking their advice around frequency of visits or mode of delivery or sites or, lots of different variables will help make sure that the trial doesn't fail for some of those, logistical reasons. Early on in the FA community, we learned that reimbursing travel isn't quite helpful enough, but having a travel agent available to book all the travel and put out the cost up front. Don't put the burden of the cost of the travel on the patient and the site to then reimburse the subject for participating in the trial. Those are things that the sponsor can take care of by hiring a third party to do all of that. Makes it easier, reduces significant burden. But that only comes about from these dialogues between the community and the sponsor and the investigator to learn and to think about what's going to make this clinical trial successful from all the stakeholders' perspectives.
I'm glad you mentioned that. It's easy to overlook, right? The hotel you stay at or how you get there and the back and forth, and those little details are easy to overlook, especially for a sponsor, right? They're more concerned about the experience and the expertise and the ability for a site to, have a pharmacy or, to manage the different elements of the trial, where you probably don't even think about how the patient gets there. And I've experienced that just in the last 5 years or so. I love my site, where I normally go. It's always great. But there have been a few little speed bumps along the way where I've just thrown it out to somebody like, hey, can we maybe adjust that or this? And they've been quick to do so. It wasn't trying to go the cheap route or something like that. It was more of we just didn't think about it, which has made a significant difference and has improved the patient experience in my case, for sure, over the years.
Yeah, and where FARA's asked now to help put together advisory panels of individuals with FA, parents of children with FA, depending on who the target audience might be for a specific trial, to pull those folks together to help review the protocol before it's finalized, to think about how things are being designed and, whether or not the risk benefit, right, is really being considered from the patient perspective. And the informed consent forms. We've conducted ad boards where we've reviewed the informed consent before it gets submitted to an IRB and fully approved to make sure that we're providing people with the information they need and need to make that informed consent decision. Somebody else isn't deciding what the information is that folks want. We're asking folks, what information do you need and want proactively? And I think that's going to help significantly going forward as, additional clinical trials come forward. Having more of that patient perspective and patient experience in the design of the trial, I think will help lead to more successful outcomes and make sure we don't have failures that could have been prevented.
Jen, with COVID-19 and people not going out of their house, much less getting on airplanes very much, how has all of that affected participation in clinical trials and the speed at which clinical trials are able to get done?
COVID-19 threw a wrench in clinical trials for sure, not just for FA, but across the board. Many clinical trials a year ago were just put on hold, right? They stopped enrolling people. So that automatically means that trial is going to be longer to completion. So in most cases, trials were halted. No new people could be enrolled. And people who were in trials, things had to change too, in terms of, if it wasn't safe for people to go to the hospital to have their study visit, sites had to figure out how are we going to get medication to them in between study visits? How are we going to find out how they're doing, what's going on. So protocols were being amended all over the place, right, to change how the study visits were going to be conducted, the data that was going to be captured. And then once folks could safely begin traveling back to clinical research centers, how do you adjust for that and, continue to collect data and preserve the integrity of the trial and try and answer your initial question about, the potential efficacy and safety of this drug or intervention. And I think the good part about COVID has been that, we've had to think about doing things a little differently. And when you're faced with those kinds of challenges, there's the opportunity to do things better or to hopefully change things for the future. One example might be less in-person visits. You know what? There is a lot we can do remotely, and we can send visiting nurses out to people's homes. And maybe we can reduce some of that burden in future clinical trials by picking up some of these lessons we've learned. There was a study that was supposed to start literally the middle of March a year ago. And the first cohort got put on hold at the very last minute due to COVID. And over the course of a few months, the sponsor, the site, the patient community figured out how to do the study differently and safely. And so we had a little bit of a delay, but we were then able to, pick back up and conduct that clinical trial and finish it only a few months delayed. Wow. And those are some of the things that have happened during the past year that I think energize all of us, continue to give us hope and see that these challenges are going to come up and we're going to have to be resourceful, creative, focused on the goal, and come up with new solutions and change our plans, sometimes mid-course.
To me, that speaks to the collaboration effort of everything FARA believes in, and most of our listeners and we believe in, is getting all the different parties at the table and trying to come up with ways to tackle the problem that work for everybody. And I know that's something that FARA launched its mission centered around, and Barbara talked about it, and Amicus and Horizon. Everybody has mentioned the power in working together, and I think what you just said there is a beautiful example of just bring everybody to the table and let's figure out, instead of stopping and putting it on pause, there's got to be a different way of doing it. And I value that COVID has kind of pushed most of us, if not all of us, into that space of having to figure out another way.
Well, Jen, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure to connect with you about this, and I know our listeners got a lot of value out of the conversation. Sean and I are definitely looking forward to the next time we get to come over and have dinner.
Definitely.
Sounds great. I can't wait either. Although, Sean, I promise I will not make salmon.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I almost put burgers on the list because they are a go-to in our home, and to the point of where I won't order a burger out because I prefer my home cooked burger.
You can do it better.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah.
Love it. Well, Jen, thank you very much for joining us today and being a part of this show.
Was really honored to do so, and thanks for letting me go along on some of my discussion topics. I really appreciated it.
What a valuable conversation, especially for those of us who are participating in clinical trials in order to get us all to the ultimate finish line. We close every single episode out with thank you notes showing a little gratitude, but this is a special chance that we get to hear from Jen with her thoughts on gratitude.
At the end of all your shows, you share your thank you notes. And as a listener to the podcast over the last few years, I just want to say that I'm really grateful to both of you for helping me really see and understand how important gratitude is. because in all honesty, I think I undervalued it, and didn't appreciate how gratitude is important, not only for the person receiving the gratitude, but for the person who is seeing the opportunity to give gratitude and doing so. And whether it's for something really small or something, really big. And it's just remarkable to me how many times your other guests have talked about gratitude being a key aspect of how they navigated a really horrible time in their life. And I just want to thank you both for helping me understand more about gratitude and making me be more accountable for myself and for others in my life for acknowledging and sharing that gratitude.
Thank you for listening to the Two Disabled Dudes podcast. This show is possible with your support. Visit twodisableddudes.com to donate.
Connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app.